A very warm welcome to everyone to the 7th webinar of our Agora webinar series. Today's webinar is on heat decarbonization, lessons for the smart sector integration strategy of the EU to achieve the long-term climate goals. On the panel, you see Alexandra Langenheld, who's Senior Associate at Team Germany of Agora Energiewende. Then we have Jan Rosenow, Principal and Director of European Programs at the Regulatory Assistance Project, or RAP. We have Peter Melvik, Project Manager at the Institute for Energy and Environmental Research, IFOI. And we have Richard Loos from the University of Exeter. He's a researcher. Maybe you can just wave your hand, because actually, even though I see your names, the audience doesn't see it. So Peter, if you would like to raise your hand once. Yeah, that's Peter. And then Richard maybe as well. Say hello. Great. We also have Janne Görlach, who's trainee at the Communications Department of Agora Energiewende. I'm Nicola Bock, Head of Events at Agora Energiewende. Now, what's going to happen during the next hour? We will have two different presentations on the heat decarbonization topic, and this will last around 30 to 35 minutes. So we should have a good 15 minutes at the end for your questions, and we will have a question and answer session then. We also have prepared one poll to give you the opportunity to interact a little more with us. Now, even though we cannot see you, of course, you have the opportunity to get in contact with us. There are two options on the bottom of your screen. If you use your cursor, you have two buttons. One is the chat and one is the Q&A or F&A for the ones who use the German system. The chat we will use primarily in order to give you important links. For instance, the link to the presentations on the website, I've already uploaded them, and Janne will be sharing them with you now. So if you want to download it, you can already do that. We also have a general email address, which is webinar@agora-energiewende.de, that you can use. And we will also give you the personal email addresses of the 4 panelists. You can also use the chat, so the window at the bottom on the left, for any technical issues that you might face. For your content-related questions, so anything that comes up to your mind during the presentations, it would be great if you use the Q&A section only, because that gives us the opportunity to pick the questions and then read it out on your behalf. Janne will do that to the panelists. And whenever your question is being picked, it will then automatically become visible for the audience. So that brings me to the next point. We are recording the webinar once again in order to make it available also for anyone who cannot participate at the moment. And if you do not want to leave any footprints there, then you should refrain from putting your questions into the Q&A session and yes, communicate them in another way to us. Right, I think the poll will follow a little later, but it's going to be on the future role of Power-to-X in the building sector. I can already say that. And with this, I will hand over to Alexandra.
Thank you, Nicola, and welcome to everybody online from my side as well. Decarbonizing heat is critical for meeting climate and clean air goals, but still underrepresented in the political debate. Therefore, with the European Commission currently developing a smart sector integration strategy and envisaging a renovation wave of buildings in the context of the European Green Deal, even during Corona crisis, we believe it's timely to reflect on the available strategies and technologies, principles, and also policy instruments. We will do so in the next hour on the basis of 2 recent published reports. On one hand, the building sector efficiency, a crucial component of the energy transition, by Agora, together with EFOI and partners, and heating without the hot air, principles for smart heat electrification by REP and the University of Exeter. Today's webinar, as you might have realized, is the second in a row discussing on lessons for the smart sector integration strategy of the EU to achieve the long-term climate goals, but also keeping in mind the 2030 horizon. As assets in the heat, respectively in the building sector, have the most durable capital stocks, the 2030 challenge to reduce emissions is enormous and urgently needs to be addressed. Now, what are drivers and windows of opportunities for heat decarbonization in that context? As for the drivers, first and foremost, there is the 2050 climate neutrality objective of the EU. But also Germany, with the Climate Change Act of 2019, committed to the goal of achieving climate neutrality by 2050, and at the same time has put the current domestic 2030 target into law. And net zero emissions can only be reached with a decarbonization of the heating sector. Second, there is the already mentioned European Green Deal and increasing citizens' concerns about air pollution. Now, what are windows of opportunities arising from that? Well, the current EU framework for decarbonizing heating must be correctly transposed and implemented, and the next months are crucial in that respect. One prominent requirement being that until end of this year, all new buildings are nearly zero energy buildings, according to the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, opening up the opportunity to ban installations of oil and gas boilers and new connections to the gas grid. In addition, the Commission has a key role when evaluating the NECPs. That actually has to happen by June 2020, this year, and the long-term renovation strategies of the member states. And then there is the renovation wave of buildings, which is an opportunity to put the building sector on a pathway towards carbon neutrality. And in the context of the review of its 2020 work program, the European Commission considers that renovation wave a key element of any post-COVID recovery plan because of its benefits for stimulating economic activity, suggesting the timing to be maintained for autumn. And finally, the smart sector integration strategy. Even though the strategy to facilitate the smart integration of the electricity, heating, transport, and industry sectors is considered an important blueprint for the energy transition, a postponement is currently seen by the Commission as not detrimental. Therefore, the file could be packaged with other initiatives, such as the State of the Energy Union report in October. Therefore, the plan for today is as follows. You had me with a very brief setting of the scene. I will hand over now next to Jan and Richard to present their paper, exploring the principles and policies for achieving smart integrated heat decarbonization. Afterwards, Peter will present our study commissioned by Agora Energiewende, exploring the value of energy efficiency in buildings, cost effectiveness and resilience of alternative options, such as renewables, heat pumps, synthetic fuels, together with myself, wrapping up in the very end with the conclusions drawn by Agora Energiewende. We will have, as Nicola said, a poll in between the two presentations and a short Q&A in the end. Jan Richard, over to you. I will stop sharing my screen now.
Hi, and good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can all hear me and see my screen. It's great to be here and speak to you. And this is the fourth webinar in a series of webinars on decarbonizing heat, which RAP has run over the last 4 weeks. So Richard and I have been doing this sort of pretty much every week now. And we're getting used to doing that. And I'm sure you all get used to working from home and using these tools more and more. You may get some background noise from my kids. They're downstairs and they're often quite noisy, so I apologize for that in advance. And they may even come in and ask me some questions. I hope that's not going to happen, but you never know. So thanks for the introduction. That's great for setting the scene. So Richard and I will now speak about the principles and policies for heat electrification, which we developed over the last year or so. And this is based on a report that we published in March this year, and I believe that will be shared with the attendees later on, or perhaps already has been shared in the chat. So before we start the formal part of the presentation, we should disclose that both Richard and I are not just analysts of heat policy, we're also consumers, and we have, both of us have decarbonized our own homes over the course of the last couple of years. So this is my house in Oxford, where I'm sitting right now, a very old, typical Victorian English house, which I have decarbonized to a significant degree, about 60%, about 70% per square meter reduction, if I also factor in the extension we've built, and that's mainly through energy efficiency measures and the installation of a heat pump. And Richard, who is currently in Falmouth in Cornwall, has also done the same. And Richard, you've just crunched the numbers, I think, for your house that you will share with us, I believe, when you take over the presentation in a minute. So we now move towards the formal part of this presentation after this very brief introduction. And Richard will kick us off by presenting on the wider context of heat decarbonization, what the different options are, the different technologies. And he will also then look in particular at why electrification is a key option for electrifying and decarbonizing heat. Richard, I will then take over again the presentation and present on the principles and policies, but over to you for now. I'm going to mute myself, and then you can take over the presentation.
Thanks very much, Jan, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks very much for joining. And the first thing I wanted to say is that Jan and I weren't competing, but in doing substantial insulation works, I've managed to reduce the emissions from my house by 85% compared to how it was before. That's close to really where we need to get to for our net zero goals. So what that means is that rapid progress actually is possible, and we can do things now. And like Jan, that was through primarily energy efficiency, but also using an air source heat pump. So thanks, Jan. Next slide. So I've been working on heat decarbonisation for over a decade now, really. And prior to going into academia, I was working for a gas network operator in the UK. And really, actually not much has happened in terms of the heat sector in the EU over the past decade. But with the introduction of the net zero goals and in alignment with the Paris Agreement, the decarbonisation of heating across the EU needs to happen more rapidly and more thoroughly than it did before. And if anything, this challenge has become even more pressing. And there's been a great deal of focus on the electricity sector, where extreme, major strides have been made. But half of the EU's energy use, as many of us know, comes from heating, and the vast majority, around 75% of that heat, comes from fossil fuels. And quite simply, because of that, we can't decarbonise energy without decarbonising heating. It's just not going to happen. And the biggest segment of heating and of those emissions is space and hot water heating. Much of that happens in people's homes, in the domestic sector, and that's where our report really focused. But the arguments and the policy suggestions also apply to the service sector, places like schools, shops and buildings, where it's all about space heating and hot water demand. Thanks. So there are quite a few technologies that can actually produce low carbon heating, but how they can be deployed at scale varies significantly. So solar thermal technologies have been used for many years that convert sunlight directly into hot water. I'm a big fan of solar thermal. It's a relatively cost-effective technology, and it can be deployed fairly easily. And it's also very low carbon. However, scaling it up to a level where it can have a significant impact on emissions, particularly at countries in the northern latitudes, where there are large seasonal swings in heat demand, shorter days, for example, in the winter and colder winters, it doesn't seem like it's a technology that can be easily scaled up without some sort of large strategic interseasonal storage. Now, Bioenergy is also potentially an important technology for heating. However, there are questions over how much bioresource there actually is, and there are also wider concerns around whether it really is green and whether it is low carbon. And there are also, of course, local concerns around air quality and local emissions. Geothermal is another technology which has been used in certain countries, but again, this is limited by geography. You need to be near a decent source of geothermal heat, and we're talking about deep geothermal here, so we're really drilling down into the earth. You need to be near a source of heat, and that heat source needs to be near a population or near a heat demand. And there are just only a few, or there are certain places where that makes sense, but it can't work everywhere. And finally, across Europe, and indeed as I've experienced in the UK, hydrogen is being promoted as a potential means to decarbonise the gas grid. I think it's fair to say this is still a very uncertain option in that it's never been really done at scale. We don't know how much it will cost and how possible it is. And it's certainly not something that will happen in the short term. So that leaves a gap of maybe 10 or 15 years before hydrogen can happen. And that's why we think electrification can fill this gap immediately, and progress can be made now. So the expected widespread use of electricity for low carbon heating in the future has been known for a long time, over a decade, I'd say, and various countries have supported technologies which use electrification and use low carbon heat. It's quite simply, it's an important approach because we now know how to produce low carbon electricity with renewables or with nuclear perhaps, and it's relatively easy to turn that electricity into heat with resistance heaters, but also heat pumps are a particularly important technology, and that's because you get much more energy out from a heat pump than the electricity you put in. Heat pumps can of course also be connected to district heating networks. But I would say electrifying heat shouldn't be seen as easy or something that will necessarily happen, and lots of practical and on-the-ground practical action is required. But there is room to be optimistic here, in particular, as we've seen in the UK, the cost reductions in offshore wind and wider cost reductions in solar PV mean that as the cost of electricity is reducing, the cost of electrifying heat will also be reducing. And in fact, the UK's Committee on Climate Change, in their analysis of what net zero would look like, have said that the extra 20% going from our previous 80% target to our net zero target actually will now be effectively free because of those cost falls. So those cost falls already mean that that extra 20% slice will cost no more than we thought 80% reductions would cost. So just moving on to this graph, now it does look quite complex, but don't worry. It's really quite simple. It just shows the emissions intensity across Europe, across different European countries. And what it shows is that across European countries, those emission intensities are falling, and they've been falling for decades, and they continue to fall. Now, the pinky purple line in the middle, that's the smoothest line, that shows the average European emissions. And you can see they have been falling consistently and steadily, and this goes up to 2016. What's happened basically is the costs of renewables have reduced, the deployment of renewables has increased, and meanwhile the highest carbon energy has been pushed off electricity systems, resulting in this reduction. At the average European level at the moment, by using a heat pump, you will already be reducing emissions compared to a gas boiler. As these emissions from electricity continue to fall, there will be, of course, further emissions reductions from electricity and from the use of electricity for heating. Now, sorry, next slide again, thank you. Now, this graph shows the example of the UK, and it shows how in the UK emissions intensities compare for electric heating compared to gas heating. So gas is shown as that purple line in the flat line in the middle. And what you can see is that the rapid fall in emissions intensities in the UK mean that even what's referred to in this graph as basic electric heating, which is just standard electric heaters, that's now lower carbon than using gas for heating. However, the efficiencies of heat pumps mean that you effectively get much greater emissions reductions cuts by using a heat pump, because the coefficient of performance, that is the efficiency of the heat pump, you can basically divide the emissions intensity of the electricity by that number. And for example, for my heat pump, which has a COP of around 3.6, I am almost 3/4, or certainly 3 to 4 times lower than the carbon intensity of gas currently. Thanks, Jan. I'll hand it back over to you now.
Thanks, Richard. I will now present to you the principles, some of the key policies. I know that Peter will also touch on some of those issues in his presentation when he talks about the heat decarbonization pathways for Germany. So I will touch on some of that in my presentation, but leave the modeling results of that study that I think is really insightful to Peter to present. So let me now start to talk about the 4 principles that we have. 1 slide for each principle. Then I have 1 slide on the policies that we need, and 1 slide on conclusions. So 6 more slides from me. And the first principle is, and you would expect that from someone who's worked on energy efficiency for more than 15 years, is that energy efficiency needs to be put first in all of this. And the reason for that is at least twofold. One reason, and that is the reason that is probably most widely discussed, is that it reduces system cost. And there's lots of studies from the IEA, from the European Commission, national governments, and research institutes that all indicate that without energy efficiency, decarbonizing heating will be a lot more expensive. And that is simply because energy efficiency offers a lot of cost-effective savings, which can be materialized. The second, and this is often overlooked, this reason, is that energy efficiency increases the thermal storage capacity of buildings. So a more insulated building can keep the heat for much longer, so you can actually avoid having to heat your building over peak periods, which is really important when we electrify heat, as we don't want to overload the grid. So having more thermal storage in the building allows you to operate the heating system flexibly. And this has been done, for example, by Dong Energy Distribution in 2011-2012 in Denmark. It has been tested successfully, and they have really amazingly managed to avoid the peaks by simply cascading the heat pumps in a flexible way. The potential for doing this is actually quite high. There was a study that came out last week, and they indicated that up to 40% of peak load could be reduced by managing heat loads and other loads in the building more smartly. So the second principle is to recognize the value of flexible load. And that is so important as we move towards a world where we have a lot more renewables on the system. We've all seen the amazing progress that has been made with more renewables, but we also know that this means more intermittency, and it means also that there's a need for more flexible demand that can follow the more flexible supply that we're witnessing. And essentially what this means for heat electrification is to shift heat consumption out of peak hours into those hours of the day when there's renewables on the system, to avoid having to run those plants that have high emissions over the course of the peak hours to accommodate that load. So that's where a lot of the potential lies in sector integration. And Alexandra alluded to the smart sector integration strategy that's coming forward. Really, buildings become an integral part of the power system and almost act as a thermal battery to balance the grid. And I'm sure Peter will touch on some of that in his presentation later on. The third principle is that it's really important as we electrify heating to understand the emission effects of changes in load. These curves here show how carbon emissions per kilowatt hour of electricity differ over the course of a day. You don't need to understand exactly the details of this. It's just important to note that they differ, and it depends when you consume electricity as much as how much you consume. So it really matters when we consume electricity as to how many carbon emissions that generates. And ideally, if we electrify heating, we would follow that curve in such a way that we minimize emissions. The question is, how can we actually encourage people to do that? Right now, most people have heat demand that is completely disconnected from a curve like this. So the fourth and final principle is to design tariffs to reward customers for flexibility. And this is because you can actually reward customers to make those changes to their heating systems in a way that delivers benefits for both the power system, for the customers themselves, and for the planet. And this is an example from my own home that this is an app I'm using to monitor the consumption of my heat pump. And the blue line here shows the tariff that I'm paying, which varies every 30 minutes. So you can see that particularly during the hours 4 and 7 o'clock in the evening, that the tariff goes up to 20, 25 pence per kilowatt hour. And then the other hours of the day, it's a lot lower. The red bars here show consumption, and you can see that the consumption is very low during those peak hours, 4 to 7 o'clock in the evening. And what does this mean? This means essentially that I pay less than half of the money for my energy bill than I would have to pay if I simply had a flat electricity tariff. So designing tariffs in such a way can have huge benefits for customers by effectively reducing their energy bills and delivering system services. So what kind of policies do we need to deliver on all of this? And I only have a very short amount of time left to go through this. But essentially, there are 4 steps that we see are needed. The first is to have policies in place to reduce the heat demand. This is mainly building codes, financial assistance programs for energy efficiency. The second step is to reduce the intensity of the heat energy carrier. And we've seen the amazing reductions that Richard has shown on his slide in the electricity sector, which, as more we go into that direction, we will decarbonize heat if we also electrify. And the third step is that we need to deploy low carbon heat technologies. And that is an area where we haven't made much progress in Europe. I don't know how many of you have seen the paper that came out, I think, a couple of weeks ago from Brian Mathieson from Aalborg University, who led the Heat Roadmap Europe project. But that showed that we really are a long way from replacing fossil heating systems in Europe. And how can this be achieved? Again, you have a similar policy menu as for reducing heat demand. Financing systems and building codes would play a key role here. And finally, we need to encourage the flexible operation of heating, and that can be done through electricity pricing and time of use tariffs, for example. Let me now come to the conclusions before we hand over to Peter. So the first conclusion is that decarbonizing heat is critical for meeting our climate and clean air goals, and Alexandra has made that point already. Electrification is a central pillar, at least in the next 5 to 10 years, probably beyond that. Energy efficiency is key to minimizing costs and also building in thermal storage, which is often overlooked. And the flexible operation of heat pumps is possible if it's encouraged by the right kinds of tariffs. And we need a whole range of policy instruments to accelerate the replacement rates of fossil heating systems. That's all the time I have, I'm afraid, and I will now hand over to Peter. Thank you.
Actually, I think I will jump in with our poll. At least that's what we said before. I will, hang on, I just changed this, read out the question to you. And it should appear on your screen now, yes. How do you expect the future role of Power-to-X in the building sector? And 5 different answers are possible. I will read them out to you because the poll is not being recorded. A, basic energy source in 2050. B, essential part of energy supply. C, minor part of energy supply. D, only for single application. E, there will be no PTX in 2050. And the audience is voting. At the moment, only I can see that, but there's still something going on. So I will wait some more time to make sure that everyone who wants to vote gets the opportunity. Okay, it's slowing down. I'll give it another 3 seconds, and then I will finish the poll and make the results available for you. You should now be able to see them. There's a clear winner. Answer B, essential part of energy supply. 44% equaling 54 persons think this will be the future role of PTX, followed by minor part of energy supply, which was voted by 26%, 32 persons. And then only for single application, 18% or 22 persons. Some 9% voted it's going to be the basic energy source in 2050. and 3% think there will be no PTX in 2050. And now with this, I hand over to Peter.
Okay. Thank you very much, and welcome. Good afternoon, and thanks for joining today. That's a very interesting poll. Let's see if we should repeat that after my presentation, but let's see, I can follow up with that. So what I want to show you is mainly the importance of efficiency in the building sector and how this relates to the achievement of long-term targets. It's 2018. Some things already have changed since then, but it's almost still valid. The client was Agora Energiewende, and it was accompanied by the steering committee of BPIE, Assistance Project as well, and ECF. And IFOY was not alone. We did this together with Fraunhofer, IEE, and Consentec. The main question why we started that whole thing was what are the consequences for buildings or energy systems and networks if the planned saving measures for buildings are not implemented, but instead more heat pumps, synthetic fuel, or renewables have to be used to achieve the climate targets anyway. And how did we do this? We took a national economic perspective. We choose a climate target of minus 87.5% of GHG reduction. That was the middle of the bandwidth 2 years ago. In the meantime, we're aiming for climate neutrality. But 87.5% reduction is still very ambitious. We looked at compliance with the building targets for 2030 as well, of course, for all scenarios. And what we did was a system optimization. We tried to have this energy efficiency very, very ambitious, but still realistically. We took this one efficiency scenario as a reference for the other scenarios. We started with the background of the discussion, which was sometimes quite profound. In choosing the future is either all electric or all gas. Another one said technology openness enables less insulation, or PTX enables us to use existing heating technologies, which means condensing gas boilers. Or today's incentives and requirements for buildings are already sufficient. And this, of course, is mainly for the German building sector, but maybe even for other member states. So what we did was calculating 5 scenarios. So as I said, the first one, the reference, is one we called efficiency square, because this has the highest efficiency of all. And we don't have really to look at the quantity of these rectangles here. They just symbolize different energy sources, and there's a certain mix in this efficiency square scenario. The thing is that we can compare the other scenarios to this reference and say, okay, the others, they have less efficiency, and this less efficiency, which is above the dotted line, has to be compensated by using more renewables or more heat pumps or more power to gas. And still we added this one on the very right, which goes without more efficiency, which is business as usual, plus PTG. And we see, okay, the demand, the energy demand total is even more, and there this surplus has to be compensated completely with synthetic gases. So we try to assess the results in two ways. Of course, on the one hand, the economic costs. And on the other hand, we still thought, okay, money is not everything. Can we implement all these paths in the same way? Or are there specific opportunities or specific risks? Are some scenarios harder to implement than others? But first, we look at the costs. To calculate the costs, we had to couple 4 models. I won't go through all of this graph. It's just, we started with the building model, and coming from that, we went into an energy optimization model, on the other hand, to a heat atlas and electricity grid model, and they all fed in their cost to the total cost for the whole German energy supply. So, of course, we see if we save energy in buildings, this has implementations in the electricity grid, for instance. And I but it's more easy than you might think. First, I show the really final result. This is the total cost difference. So imagine the reference scenario. So this efficiency square scenario would be the 0 line. And if the other scenarios are more expensive, they go upward, and downward is only 1. That is, causes less cost. So we see, yes, the efficiency plus heat pumps scenario causes less cost than the efficiency square, but all the others are more expensive. And then we can look why, what are the cost drivers? And of course, we see this one block, it shows the cost for efficiency, for building insulation mainly. And of course, all scenarios. On the other hand, we see they have to cost for plant engineering, and especially in the scenario with much renewables, this is a quite high cost block. And in this business as usual, we have mostly gas boilers, and so there are considerable savings. District heating is only in the scenario with much renewable energy sources, major point, but also in this business as usual scenario, where it's considerable. Electricity grids, maybe astonishingly, playing a decisive role. Might be driven because traffic also changes to electricity to a huge rate, and has to be built anyway, the grids. So certainly the biggest cost block is this power to gas import. And here we see, of course, these 2 power to gas scenarios to the right, they really suffer from this huge cost blocks. They make the difference. So maybe that's for the poll. Not only the cost, specific opportunities and risks. And we looked at a lot of issues in this respect. So, say the market ramp up or energy imports, how resilient are certain scenarios, or how is the acceptance of some scenarios. We do this right now, it's far too much, but we look at the market ramp up and at the flexibility of the scenarios. And of course, these minus 87.5% scenarios are all, yes, they require a high market change for all technologies. And Richard, he showed us that the possibilities are very limited. There are just some renewable energy sources and they all have restrictions. But here we see what was needed. And we see the lower efficiency must always be compensated by even steeper growth of renewable energies. But efficiency and renewables in every scenario must be ambitiously implemented in the short term. The decisive factor is the technology that meets the requirement with realistic effort. So we see that the efficiency square scenario sees insulation volume must triple in the short term in Germany. So this is already a huge market, but it has to be rise by 3 times. In the scenario efficiency plus renewables, solar thermal systems have to grow 15-fold. So this is extreme, but also district heating must increase extremely 4-fold. And district heating is something you cannot raise very steeply, not like shown here. The efficiency plus PTG scenario requires 102 gigawatt of generation capacity for power plants, and that's only for producing synthetic gases. In the business as usual scenario, it requires 178 gigawatt. And just to compare this, the current capacity of renewables in Germany is 118. So it has to more than double in the next decades. And it has, yes, all to be renewable. And also for the heat pumps, at the moment we have about 78,000 heat pumps in Germany installed every year. This has to rise to 200,000 per year until 2030, and even to so very steep market ramp up, and one can imagine which ramp up is more likely or is less likely. So we see it's this is a very high risk, and I wouldn't say that the ramp up for insulation materials is easy. It's, as I said, triple in the short term, but it's only triple. It's not 15-fold like solar energy. And we try to look at this flexibility of the scenarios. If you use more efficiency, you have more flexibility to react to even more ambitious climate targets. So we were aiming for minus 87.5%. If on the way the target would change to 100% reduction, which we see at the moment, you're still able to achieve this. If you have too little efficiency, you cannot change. You cannot go further with that aim. And this higher efficiency also enables reaction to unexpected changes. So if the renewable potentials don't need to be fully exploited, you can say, okay, I go for more renewables to even fulfill the targets. The other thing is that many renewable potentials are already only raised by higher efficiency. So the easiest example is that you cannot install heat pumps in badly insulated buildings. You need buildings that are already efficient to install heat pumps. And so these two parts, they really depend on each other. So this is my last slide, and I would hand over the presentation again. Thank you very much.
Very much, and I will be wrapping up and taking over from here. We believe efficiency in buildings is key for the achievement of long-term climate goals, and with a business as usual in decarbonizing heat and efficiency policies, the climate targets for 2030 and 2050 will be missed. And in essence, there are 4 key findings for a successful heat decarbonization. On one hand, you did see it in view of the necessary market ramp up for insulation materials, heat pumps, renewals, and synthetic fuels. All options need to be pursued with determination and planning, and in order to move towards target goals. And only if there is a massive scale up of all available technologies across the board, heat decarbonization will be successful. And second, in the light of this, efficient buildings are critical and the prerequisite for technology neutrality. Adequate insulation of buildings is the basis for the application of the entire range of heating technologies, from heat pumps, heat networks, and solar thermal systems to the use of power to gas. Efficient buildings preserve renewables potential and flexibility, and without insulation, there is no meaningful use of renewables technology. Then thirdly, for this reason, power to gas can only complement ambitious efficiency policies in the building sector and not replace them. Synthetic fuels are certainly a significant component in all 2050 deep decarbonization scenarios, and the voting already showed that as well, that the audience believe in that as well, but they are urgently required in hard to abate sectors like industry, transport, and aviation, and they really shouldn't be wasted. Consequently, there is no easy way around speeding up the renovation rate if heat decarbonization is to make any significant contribution to climate targets in 2030 and beyond. And a roadmap building efficiency 2030 is hence required. What do we mean by that? Well, a targeted and effective package of instruments to align incentives and requirements with the targets and the long-term goals, and make best possible use of refurbishment occasions, implement flanking measures. And the envisaged smart sector integration strategy, but also the renovation wave of buildings in the context of the European Green Deal are excellent opportunities for this. The presented reports can be freely downloaded at our website. I believe the links have been shared already with you. You can find the link as well as further publications on related topics by Agora Energiewende on that slide. And actually with that, I would like to thank you all for your attention. You can find all our contacts here. And over to you, Jan and Nicola, for some questions.
I think I'll directly hand over to Janne because apparently there's no need to explain again how it works. So Janne, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much for your questions, and Richard and Jan for already answering some of them. A question from Susanne Ehlerding from the very beginning of your presentation is that there's a big issue in Germany about H2 in the heating sector at the moment. Is this economically and ecologically viable, and under which circumstances?
I would probably make a first go on that, and others can complement. Yeah, it's certainly a big discussion at the moment, and one of the reasons we are having this webinar here today, I would probably answer saying that the poll also demonstrated that. In particular, for deep decarbonization scenarios, synthetic fuels and also hydrogen will play a crucial role. This is for sure. But the challenge ahead, what we are seeing, and you saw in the results of our study Peter presented, the market, the ramp up is so massive for all the technologies we will need that we should be very thoughtful where we use the synthetic fuels or the hydrogen for. And we believe we shouldn't waste a valuable resource like this in the heating sector. It's totally understandable that as the renovation rate is not making any progress, there is discussion about alternative options. But I will stop now here to allow for more questions. But we believe that there are policy instruments and incentives to tackle that challenge.
Okay, so I see that Jan wants to answer the question from Malte Küper about how problematic do you see the high burden of levies and taxes on the German electricity price for the present economic feasibility of heat pumps and compared to fossil heating systems?
Thank you. That's an excellent question. And it's not just an issue in Germany, although of course electricity prices in Germany are amongst the highest, as we all know, in Europe. I think only Denmark has higher electricity prices in Europe than Germany at the moment. And a lot of the costs of the energy transition are currently shifted onto electricity prices all over Europe. There was a study a few years ago from Ecofis, now Navigant, for the European Commission, and they looked at this and they found that most of the burden falls onto electricity, which of course makes sense if you have highly carbon intensive electricity. But that's no longer the case, as Richard has shown. And quite often electricity is now really low carbon, less than 100 grams per kilowatt hour in some of the member states. And really the taxation burden and the levy burden, in my view, should be fairly distributed amongst the fuels, so we don't artificially subsidize indirectly fossil fuel heating, which actually is not a very good way of incentivizing consumers to switch to cleaner heating systems. So I think this is a huge issue. It hasn't been addressed in many places, and it should be. I think that's a really important point. Thanks for asking the question.
Another very interesting question, I think, comes from Felix Heilmann, who asked how quickly can renovation measures be ramped up as part of a stimulus package or stimulus packages? Do we need additional capacity in the construction sector to deliver renovation at the scale needed? And if yes, how can it be built?
Maybe I can take over that one as well. This is really also a great question because we are, as you might know, have semi-published, so to say, a stimulus paper just recently and are in the frame of finalizing that. And among that, of course, we are also asking ourselves what to do with the buildings and with the heating sector. And for sure, capacities need to be ramped up. But we believe one good instrument, and this it's already a good initiative also on EU level to make the link also to the EU level as well with the renovation wave. We believe that serial renovations is something which could help in that respect. Obviously not answer all the challenges and questions, but it might be a good contribution because at the moment in the building sector, it's very everything is very small scale, and therefore scaling up serial renovations would be something to be promoted. We are also placing that in our paper. We have done already actually in the EU energy transition paper published last year, and we were happy to see the renovation wave in the among the Green Deal proposal.
All right, I think we have space for one or two more questions. Guoping Hu asked that he did a rough estimate on the efficiency of power to gas the overall conversion efficiency from power to deliverable hydrogen is probably under 30%. That indicates we won't get much energy remaining after the whole process. How do you think of this fact and its future development? Maybe Jan, you want to jump in there?
Yeah, and I think Richard wants to come in as well. Just very briefly, I think that's in the Agora report, actually, the report that Peter led. You know, the difference in efficiency between using a heat pump and hydrogen is really quite remarkable. It's about a factor of 4 to 6, depending on how you run the numbers. So for 1 unit of electricity that you use to do electrolysis and turn that into hydrogen, then use it for heating, you're getting about, you know, depending on how you run the numbers, but about 0.7, maybe 0.6 units out of heat. And if you do the same with a heat pump, you get about 3 units out of heat back for 1 unit of electricity. So the difference is about 4 to 6 in efficiency between the two processes. Although I would say that you know, there is certainly an important difference between the two technologies. Hydrogen can store energy in a way that electricity cannot that easily. And I think that needs to be acknowledged. So there may be some role for hydrogen, in my view, for interseasonal balancing. And perhaps there's some merit for hybrid systems in certain locations. But I think for providing bulk heat, hydrogen just needs a lot more renewable electricity, which makes the cost of that a lot higher than going for electrification through heat pumps.
Yeah, so I would generally agree with what Jan has just said then. The UK's Advisor Committee on Climate Change has said that they basically don't see 100% hydrogen for 100% of the existing gas demand route as a sensible one, because if it were to be produced using electricity, so renewables, you'd have a much higher requirement for electricity generation capacity than you would if you were using heat pumps. And actually, I've seen media reports which have suggested the German gas strategy is saying similar things at the moment. I think it's important to say that a lot of the pushback from the gas industry in the UK that has been promoting hydrogen has been pushing the production of hydrogen from methane using carbon capture and storage. That's very different to producing hydrogen from electrolysis. And it also has big questions over imports of gas and where the gas will come from. But the only way that they could really make it look cost effective compared to electrification using heat pumps was by producing that hydrogen from methane.
Okay, then maybe last very brief question. What will be the role and impact of CO2 prices to accelerate green heating? Maybe to end this discussion round. Very interesting so far.
I'm happy to take that if no one else is stepping forward. So I know that there's a lively debate, particularly in Germany right now, about this subject, and we've done some modeling last year on the impact of taxation, different levels of carbon prices effectively, on what this means for end-use prices. And you would need to have quite a high carbon price to really incentivize a switch between one technology to another, or to really ramp up the investment in energy efficiency. So if you have a carbon price of 10 euros, say, per ton, or 20 euros, it's really not going to make a big difference. It would need to be at least 50 or 100 euros per ton. And I'm just skeptical as to whether we get to such a high price in any of the member states in the foreseeable future. I know it's being discussed currently in several places, but the politics of this are complex. So I think there is a role for that, but we have to be cautious as to whether we see that as the main mechanism of delivering heat decarbonization.
Okay, thank you very much. With this, I thank all the participants for the very interesting questions and all the panelists for the interesting answers, and I will hand back to Nicola now.
Yes, thanks very much for your two presentations, Alexandra, Jan, Peter, and Richard. And thanks for participating again to everyone watching us. You've watched the different links in the chat. You still have the download links for the different studies and presentations, and you have our contact email addresses. So in case of any still open questions or so, just let us know, send us an email, and we'll be happy to answer. The recording of the webinar will appear on our website next week in case you would like to re-watch parts of it or the whole, or if you would like to move it forward to someone else. All the other recordings of the webinars we've had so far can also now be found on the website. Janne, if you could add the link in the chat, that would be great. Just the general one to our events section on the website, that's fine. And the webinar series will have a break next week in order to tidy up a bit, but we will be back on Tuesday, 12th of May, and it's going to be about speeding up the energy transition in Korea. In that week, we will also have a webinar on the topic Alexandra was just mentioning, the Green Stimulus paper, which will soon be published. And then we will also have a webinar on de-risking renewables. In the middle of next week, all these should be on the website, so you can register and participate if you're interested. Thanks for joining. Stay healthy, stay happy, and stay at home still, unfortunately, but I think we have to. And we hope to see you next time. And for anyone who has a bank holiday tomorrow, enjoy the free day. It's free no matter if you can go out or not, or go on holiday or not, but it's a free day, so enjoy it, relax, and take some time with you and your loved ones.